So a few years ago, I was reading the Seattle Times, and I read one of the most depressing articles that I've ever read. The writer was lamenting over the current state of Seattle professional sports. And again, this was a couple of years ago. And so he was pointing out that at that time, even though Seattle had lacked championships, like pro championships, because the only major team at that point that had ever won one was the 1979 Seattle Supersonics. And look at those bad boys. So he was pointing out that even with a lack of championships, at certain seasons and other seasons, not the current season he was in, Seattle had experienced several great sports heroes. And he recited different ones he could think of. For instance, in the early years, there was Steve Largent. And he was just larger than life. You know, this undersized, not so fast receiver that was absolutely brilliant. And he had humility, and he had class to go with it, and he just sort of captured the heart of the city. And then after that, Seattle had Ken Griffey Jr., like the human highlight reel, just catch after catch, homer after homer, like game winner after game winner. Now, so we might not have like a World Series title, but for a while, and this was his point, we had the greatest player in the game. And then there was Sean Kemp and Gary Payton. And maybe they lacked the humility and the class of Steve Largent. But they had personality and they had talent, and they captured the heart of the city in the 90s. And so a few years ago, the writer for the Seattle Times was asking, because it was this barren land, this barren time, he was asking, where have all the heroes gone? Like, where are the great sports personalities that can galvanize our city? And he wrote at that time about how maybe, just maybe, Felix Hernandez had hero potential. That maybe someday he could like blossom into a hero. And so that was a couple of years ago. I would maybe suggest that I think he has. He was pretty special on Friday night. Did any of you watch that game? Were any of you there? Were you any of you on the Supreme Court that night? Anybody? Absolutely no one from Brookview was there. In spirit, you were there. Then he went on and he talked about Ichiro. He said Ichiro had, he had all the talent in the world, but he lacked the personality to be a valid hero. He was just too private, too much of a loner, too isolated from his teammates and from the city and from the fans. And so this Seattle Times writer was just like begging in this article, pleading with the sports gods to send Seattle a valid hero that could electrify the city. And he wrote that even if we don't get a championship, at the very least, Seattle needs a hero to root for. Well, this last year, I would say that we were pretty blessed to have both. We got our Super Bowl. And I don't know for you, for me, it's hard to actually believe that it happened. Because after years of total depression, it's like that really happened. It doesn't seem real. And then in addition to that, I would say that we also got our hero. A guy that can lead this team for years to come. A guy with a personality that, let's be honest, you just want to root for. He's a born leader. A guy that wasn't drafted in the first or even the second round. A guy that knows just the right thing to say at just the right time. And he's just incredible with the media. He's not the ideal size for his position, which is well documented. But it doesn't stop him. He's young, but he's a leader way beyond his years. And we expect him to lead our team to several Super Bowls, to be the face of our franchise for years and years and years. Now, who am I talking about? Well, actually, I was thinking, do we have it? John Ryan. Is that guy not the best punter in the league? What a leader. Okay, I'm talking about Russell Wilson, Brendan. And you think about the charisma and the leadership and the humility. The visits to Children's Hospital every week, and you don't have to worry about what he's going to do if someone grabs him and throws a microphone in his face. Just the maturity and the likability. And I heard recently that Russell Wilson's NFL jersey is the top seller in all of the NFL now, which is pretty impressive. It's like nationwide. It's like, how do you not like this guy? How do you not root for this guy? So how many of you would say, I am a Russell Wilson fan? Oh, yeah. The rest of you. I just love the guy. And for most of us, we can't help but be fans. And we admire so much about the guy. But somewhere out there, a little boy has been watching Russell Wilson. And what has happened inside of him goes way beyond admiration. Like as he watched the Seahawks win the Super Bowl, as he watched the Hawks hoist the Lombardi trophy, something magical happened inside of him. And his heart started pounding and his mind started racing, and he thought to himself as he watched Russell Wilson, he thought, I can do what he's doing. I can be just like Russell Wilson. And now he's devoting himself to becoming just like him. Like while other little boys are doing nothing but playing Xbox and drinking Mountain Dew, he's out there doing like drill after drill after drill in the yard or wherever he can. He's eating with a purpose. He's going to every football camp. He's going to every quarterback camp. He's training like crazy. And all along, he watches every move that Russell Wilson makes. He watches film. He studies his footwork. He studies his throwing motion. He devours every article that he can find about him, reads his quotes, and he learns from how Russell Wilson leads. He watches how he conducts himself. And someday, this kid really will play in a Super Bowl. He's not just a fan. He's a follower. Okay, now, I'm not in that category. Like, I applaud Russell Wilson. I think he's amazing. But I'm not going to change my life. I'm not out in my yard with Jen, working on throwing on the run. I'm not trying to get my 40 speed down to 4.7. I could if I wanted to. Because see, I'm a fan. I'm not a follower, and there's a big difference. A fan is impressed. A follower is devoted. A fan applauds. A follower works. A fan admires. A follower gets their own skin in the game. A lot of people admired Martin Luther King Jr. Some marched with him, but few went to jail with him. Not many got their houses bombed like he did. A lot of people admired Mother Teresa, but not many followed her to live among the destitute and the dying. Now, I bring this up because we're coming to the end of this series. For 3 months, we have walked together through the Sermon on the Mount. And today we reach the end. And when Jesus gave this talk that changed the world, there was a huge crowd that was taking it all in. And he was blowing them away by how he wrapped this thing up. This is Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29. It says this is their response. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as teachers of the law. So these crowds were deeply impressed by Jesus. They admired him. There were a lot of Jesus fans among them. But as he taught, as they listened to him describe this kingdom kind of life, something happened in the hearts of a few that went way, way beyond admiration. Their hearts started pounding and their minds started racing. And as they watched Jesus and listened to his words, something deep inside of them said, okay, this is it. This is what I've been longing for my entire life without even knowing it, without being able to name it. And I can't fully explain why, but I know that this is it. I have to have this life that this man Jesus is describing. Therefore, I'll pay any price. I don't care. I trust him with everything that I am and everything that I have. I'll do whatever he wants me to do. I'll go wherever he wants me to go. And so today, I'm leaving the crowd. As of today, I'm not just an admirer anymore, not just a fan anymore. From this moment on, I'm going to live as a fully devoted follower of this man, Jesus. Now, Jesus knew that his presence and his life and his words would have this kind of impact on a few. And while he'd be incredibly gracious and patient, the goal was always to help people move from being a fan to being a follower. Like in John chapter 3, a Pharisee named Nicodemus comes to Jesus. He's a fan. Like here's the description. Here's what it says. John 3, 1 and 2. It says, "Now there was a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. Very rich, very powerful man. He came to Jesus at night and said, 'Rabbi, we know you are a teacher that has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him.'" So Nicodemus is a fan of Jesus. He admires, and that's good, right? You must have come from God. Nobody could do what you're doing if God wasn't with you. But Nicodemus comes to see Jesus at night. Why? He doesn't want anyone to know. There's too much for him to risk to be seen associating with Jesus. But Nicodemus, he's a big fan. He deeply admires Jesus. So he comes to see him. He has to come to see him. Doesn't want to be seen. Doesn't want to risk his reputation. Doesn't want to risk his status. And Jesus knows. Jesus knows what's going on. And Jesus challenges him. He says, "Nicodemus, you must be born again. You must become my follower. You must allow my Spirit to remake you. You must publicly identify with me. Nicodemus, you're going to have to lay down what you value the most in order for me to pour my life into you." And Nicodemus is like stunned and confused. And he walks away. But those words must have replayed over and over and over in his mind. And I'm guessing that they just sort of ate at him and they thrilled him all at the same time. And we don't really hear anything more about Nicodemus until much later in the story. After Jesus died, his body was brought down from the cross. He was laying there on the ground. And the disciples had all fled. The Pharisees had won. Okay, they had gotten Jesus executed. And do you remember who claimed the body of Jesus? Yeah, you remember who stepped out of the crowd to honor Jesus? Prepare his body for a proper burial? Nicodemus the Pharisee. Whew. That was a bad career move. I'll bet that he never won Pharisee of the Year after that. But he was compelled. He loved Jesus. And one day, something broke and something snapped in him, and he finally stepped out of the crowd and he went public as a follower of Jesus. Another time, a man known as the rich young ruler came to Jesus, and we're told he ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. That's a lot of admiration. You're a big fan when you do that, especially if you're a rich, powerful man. He ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. "Good teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Okay? And Jesus asks him to do something really hard and really beautiful. He looks at this very rich, very powerful young man who has everything going for him in the world, and he says, "Okay, here's what you need to do. Go sell all your possessions, feed the hungry, clothe the naked. Let go of your dependence on your status and your wealth and your power, and then come and follow me." And this rich, powerful young ruler turned and walked away. Couldn't do it. He was ready to admire Jesus, but following Jesus, there's too much sacrifice. That's where he drew the line. And what we see is Jesus was always doing this with people. Are you going to be a fan or are you going to be a follower? Like all through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is describing a new kind of life in the kingdom of God. And he just keeps insisting to people. Okay, life together with God, in God's favor, in God's presence, that life has now become available on earth to ordinary people. The realm where things are as God wants them to be is now being made manifest right here, right now. It is all around you, and you can enter into it if you wish. Now, who's eligible to be a part of God's kingdom? We've been talking about this for 3 months. Who's eligible? Well, Jesus insists anyone, like anyone at all. Everybody's welcome. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek, the people who get pushed around. Who can be a part of the kingdom? Jesus is insisting anybody at all. But Jesus closes his message with a sobering warning about all of this. The invitation was never to be a fan, to be an admirer of Jesus. The invitation is to step out of the crowd eventually and become a follower. A few weeks ago, I mentioned that a long time ago, when Scripture was read in public, people used to stand. And I was told at the end of that day that still happens in Vietnamese churches. So we're going to be full-on Vietnamese this morning, and I'm going to ask you to stand as a way to revere some very, very sacred words. And listen to how Jesus concludes this incredible talk, the most significant talk ever given in the history of the world. Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 to 29. And this comes right after, as we talked about last week, he explains to people, you need to live a golden rule life. This is what it's all about. And then he says this. He says, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. Okay, you can be seated. Jesus says for us to enter through the narrow gate. What is that? It's Jesus. Jesus said, I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life. Okay, it's love Jesus, trust Jesus, surrender to Jesus. Like, devote yourself wholly to Jesus without reservation. What's the broad way? That's the way of the crowd, the masses. It's the path of least resistance. Just kind of drift along doing whatever. Maybe even admire Jesus. But if doing things the Jesus way becomes inconvenient, then just reserve the right to do whatever you want. The whole conclusion to his sermon is a series of pictures that he just throws out like random fire. And every one of them involves a contrast designed to force a choice. There's a narrow gate or a wide gate. No third gate. There's a narrow road and a broad road. No third road. There's a good tree and a bad tree. No third tree. There are true disciples and false disciples. No third category. There's a house built on the rock and a house built on the sand. There's no third house. And Jesus says there will come a day when a lot of folks are shocked. There are a lot of people that admire Jesus but don't follow. And someday, he's going to say to them face to face, I'm sorry, but I never knew you. And they're going to say, wait a minute, Jesus. But I've attended church. I've given money. I've served in ministry. I mean, look at all of the good stuff that I've done in my life. And he's going to say, okay, I never knew you. Now, guys, that's a pretty sobering idea, isn't it? And I know several pastors that are haunted by this idea that a person could attend our church, listen to sermons, get involved on some level, maybe give some money, maybe study the Bible, maybe even be able to quote it, teach it, but never actually move from being a fan to being a follower. And to be honest with you, American churches are filled with Jesus fans. It's part of the reason the non-Christian world looks and says, I don't want any part of that. I mean, people that go to church regularly, maybe for years. Maybe they volunteer sometimes, maybe frequently. They give their time, they give their money. But the bottom line is this: they want to retain control of their lives. If getting too close to Jesus means risking something that they don't want to risk, their success at work or their reputation or their cool factor, if it would mean changing their lifestyle, if it would involve doing something that they don't want to do, then deep down in the secret place of their soul, they want to be able to say no. They want to reserve the right to say to God, okay, hands off, this is my life. And they're fans. They're not followers. Now, I'm not talking about people that are new to faith and they're just checking it out. There are a lot of people that admire Jesus and they're not followers yet, okay? Yet. Because they're just starting their journey with Jesus. They haven't really fallen in love with him yet. They haven't figured out what all of this means yet. They're just starting out, okay? So I'm not talking about that. And I'm also not talking about Christians that fall short sometimes. Because the truth is, can we be honest? That is every Christian on the face of the planet for all time. None of us trusts and none of us obeys and none of us follows Jesus to perfection. Nobody. I mean, we all have moments of weakness or doubt. We all sin. If you have to get completely beyond that, then being a true follower of Jesus is impossible. And we might as well just give up. But here's what I'm talking about, and here's what I think Jesus was talking about. It's the person that says, oh yeah, I'm definitely a believer, a follower of Jesus. Because I like what he said about this and this and this. It's really helpful. But the truth is, I really don't like, or I'm not entirely comfortable with what he said about this or this or this. It gets kind of extreme. And so to be dead honest, I don't have any intention of ever following Jesus when it comes to that stuff. Now, friends, to be a true believer, like an actual follower of Christ, requires a level of trust and action. That means that we surrender to him. It means that we're willing to trust him with our lives. Not just in one little area where we're having trouble, but the whole thing. And I want to give you what I think is a great picture of how this works. And now this is an illustration that preachers have used for years. Over 100 years. And I'm not sure who first used this in a sermon. I've actually heard it multiple places. And I know that many of you have heard this story, this illustration. I've used it before, but get over it. I'm doing it again. It involves a very true story of a tightrope walker named Charles Blondin. What a nice looking man. About 150 years ago, he came to the U.S. from overseas. And he was fascinated, actually he was kind of obsessed, with crossing Niagara Falls on a tightrope. And so he strung a hemp cord 1,100 feet across the whole thing. Now, this was 150 years ago. And he was quite an entertainer. And tightrope walking and all that was a big deal back then. Okay? And he was quite a showman. And so a crowd of over 100,000 people gathered to watch this guy do this. So can you imagine like the drama of that moment, being in that crowd? Like life or death. There's no net. Just step by step, inch by inch across Niagara Falls. Now tons of people, of course, were taking pictures of him. And so he decided he was just going to like keep going. He was loving the people oohing and ahhing. He did it the first time. He just kind of kept going back and forth. And one time he went across and he brought his own camera and took a picture of the crowd taking pictures of him. He went over another time and with a chair and he like stood on the chair, balanced the chair on the rope and stood on the chair. Another time he decided he would push a wheelbarrow across the rope. And so he turned to the crowd and he asked, "Do you believe that I can do this?" And of course, they all believed. They're like, "Oh yeah, let's see it. Sounds great. We believe." He stopped and he asked, "All right, well, who will get in the wheelbarrow?" And then it got real quiet. This crowd of 100,000 people that were screaming and yelling, they got real quiet. But one man, a guy named Harry Colcord, stepped out of the crowd, actually walked right out of the crowd, and sat down in the wheelbarrow and said, "Let's go." He climbed in, and inch by inch, step by step, they crossed Niagara Falls. Now, can you imagine that ride? Like in a wheelbarrow on a tightrope over Niagara Falls. So they make it to the other side. And of course, the crowd goes crazy again. But the crowd didn't get in the wheelbarrow. Everybody applauded Blondin, but only one man trusted him. And they went on a walk together that neither of them would ever forget. Jesus finishes the Sermon on the Mount, and everybody's amazed. Wow, Jesus, you're awesome. But Jesus isn't really interested in amazing the crowd. Jesus never went up to people and said, "Admire me." He would say things like, "Whoever wants to be my disciple, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." He's inviting you and me on the ride of our life. But you have to step out of the crowd and get in the wheelbarrow. Now here's the question this morning. Have you wholly devoted yourself to following Jesus? Like not do you admire him? Not do you believe technically? Question is, are you a follower? Like, will you, without reservation, put your life in his hands? And let's think for a second about this kinds of stuff that Jesus wants in the wheelbarrow. He wants our career in there. He wants our reputation and our status in there. He wants our money in there. He wants our sexuality in there. He wants our time, our relationships, our hobbies. He wants our vacations in there. Wants our Facebook posts, our texts. He wants all of our words, all of our life in there. And Jesus is saying to us, okay, put your worries in there too. Just let go and trust me, because I've got you. And I'm not going to let you fall. Would you just trust me? And of course, Jesus wants all of our sin and all of our shame in there. And if you're sitting here and you're going, whoa, like, I was expecting to come to church and be encouraged, and now I'm like down, man. The point is that our guilt and our sin and our shame goes in there too. And you can be free of that. I mean, you can like hold on to that really tight if you want, but Jesus is saying, throw it in there and let it go. Because Jesus laid down his life. He gave his life for us to set us free. And he's asking us to put our sin and our guilt in there along with everything else, to entrust it to him and then to let it go. But it's not an invitation to admire. It's an invitation to follow. Jen has a friend that goes way, way back, like since she was in high school. So every summer, She's been a part of this, and those of you that know her, you know this. She's been a part of this leadership camp. It had a major effect in her life. And now it's not in any way a Christian camp. It's for high school kids that are in like student government. So it's kids that get elected to like ASB office or some other position. Then Jen went when she was in ASB in high school, and then she was invited back as a junior counselor, and then she got invited back to be a senior counselor, and now that's been like 15 years of senior counselorhood. And so she has spent 1 week every summer with the same people, the same staff now for over 20 years. And in the last few years, being with the staff year after year, she has had some pretty amazing spiritual conversations. And one staff guy in particular started really asking her a lot of questions, showing a lot of interest. And he's developed a lot of respect for Jen and her life. But as he's admitted and told her, he's baffled by it. He sees the way that she lives, and he's like, I don't get it. Because he lives in this me-first world. So in a very honest moment, a while back, he said to her, he said, I've never really met anyone like you. And he just came out and asked her point blank, why do you believe? Why do you believe? Like, how can you do this? Now, that's a huge question, and that opens quite a wide door. And there's so many different ways that she could have tried to answer that. I mean, she could have talked about the historical reality of Jesus. She could have tried to make some really intellectual case. But in what I think was a God-directed divine moment, she just paused and she said, here's why I believe, here's why I follow, here's why I'm devoted to this with my life. I find that when I take my gaze off of myself, when I trust Jesus and make my life about loving Him and other people. Now, I don't get this right a lot of the time. Far too much of my focus is actually on myself. But when I actually let go, I find that there is a joy and a peace and a passion that I cannot get any other way. I do it because there's something in me that only comes alive when my life isn't about me. And she says, and Jesus said this would be the case. And I believe because I find it to be absolutely true, and I want more of it in my life. I want as much of that in my life as I can possibly get. And the funny thing is, this guy who loves to argue with everything just sat there. And he couldn't really argue with that. Like he didn't even want to. There was something beautiful about what she was saying that just rang true for him. And I think most of us have experienced this. We have. When we let go of ourselves and we trust Jesus and we make life about other people, when we let go of our wants and our rights and what we deserve, when we forget all about the stuff that we're certain that we're entitled to, when we're simply trusting Jesus and walking with Him, there is a joy in life and depth that we experience that's true and it's real. And if you're someone that knows about that, if you've started to do that and you felt that you know, and for most of you, you deeply want the people that you love in your life to experience that too. You want them to experience it with you. And so I want to just do a little aside and piggyback on what Jen was saying. Next week is Easter, okay? And it is an incredible opportunity to get people who might not otherwise be interested to come to church and to sit down for an hour and a half, think about their life, think about God, think about His goodness. And it's amazing what can happen in a room like this that's filled up with people who are praying and worshiping in someone's heart. And so inside of your bulletin, there's a little flyer that looks like this. It says My Easter Sunday Invites. Okay, I just would encourage you to think about anywhere from 1 to 3 people that you would want to invite and just jot their first name down. Somebody that you think this week you might actually invite. And we have people in our church this week in our life groups that are going to pray for every name that gets put down on these. So if you want someone to know Jesus, you want someone to experience God, and you're thinking about inviting them, and you're scared, and you're not sure if they're going to say yes, and you're not sure if they come, if they're going to like it, let's pray together about it. So I would just encourage you up to up to 3. Well, it looks like there's even 4 slots. Far be it from me to keep you from writing down 4 names. Jot that down, and when the offering goes by later, you can drop it in there, and we will pray for that together. Jesus closes his talk with a profound idea, okay? This is verses 13 and 14 again. It says, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And guys, he isn't just talking about getting to heaven one day. He's not. He's talking about kingdom life now. A different kind of life is available to us in part right now. And how do you enter into that life? It's very simple. You learn from Jesus how to be like Jesus. You trust him and you get in the wheelbarrow. Now maybe you're here and you look at your life lately, and if you were honest, you'd come to a place where you would admit, you know what, I recently have been living a lot more like a fan than a follower. And I just want you to know something. Okay, if you're here, that's okay. It's okay. I mean, being a fan is really a good thing. It's just not the ultimate thing. Jesus is inviting you to step out of the crowd. Because maybe, just maybe, for you, it's time to stop watching other people. Like to just sit in the crowd and watch other people go on this amazing ride and this amazing journey. Maybe it's time for you to step out and go on your own ride, to go on your own journey with Jesus. A few weeks ago, I had a day in my life that I'll never forget. We, in the morning, it was on a Sunday, in the morning, we had one of the best church services that I can ever remember. It was just a really cool day, and we talked about prayer that morning. And then people laid out their requests before God, and they brought them up and they laid them down, and for a lot of people it was a very powerful moment. And I heard stories from different people who knew people or different people directly about how powerful that was for them. And so it was really, really cool for me to watch that and for us to be able to participate in that together. Right after church in the afternoon, I performed a memorial service. A 14-year-old boy named Quinn. And I talked about this several weeks ago. Many of you know about this, you remember. But he committed suicide. And the memorial service was so tough. And yet at the same time, it was, I don't know how to blend these two together, but it was incredibly beautiful. Jen and I had met with Quinn's parents earlier that week, just the two of them, just mom and dad. And they knew they had no idea what they wanted for this service, but they knew they wanted something. And they don't go to church. They're not Christ followers. So we brainstormed with them and gave them ideas and put together a service that we had hoped would really honor their son. And they had asked my daughter, Kate, to share at the service because she had grown up with this boy. In fact, he had taken her to homecoming in the fall. And she did such a beautiful job. And I was so proud of her. And the service just went so well. And after the service, Quinn's dad came up and he hugged me, and it wasn't the normal bro hug, And he just held on. And he thanked me over and over and over. And I don't know how to explain it to you, but I just felt God in that moment and in the service, and it was, I can't really explain it. So that got over. Jen and I immediately got in the car. We drove to Ignite for our church, and we spent the evening there with our Brookview family. And we celebrated what God is doing in his church here, and the way that God is just unleashing his blessings on what's happening here, especially these last few months. And so we prayed, and we worshiped with everybody, and we shared stories, and it was really just kind of surreal. And so at the end of the day, we got home from all of that, and Jen and I were laying in bed, and we were exhausted. And I said, babe, that was a long, beautiful day. And she said, I know, I'm exhausted. But that was incredible. And then we were too tired to talk about it anymore. And I don't know any other way to describe it. It was one of those days I could feel the kingdom of God around me all day. And it was so real, and it was so beautiful. And I was a part of it somehow. So as I drifted off to sleep, I just said, thank you, Jesus. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. Like, despite my past and the horrendous things that I've done, despite how many times I've run away from you, thank you for letting me be a part of this. And guys, I'm going to get real honest with you. I have never felt more deeply satisfied than I did that day. I've never felt more at peace. I've never felt more joy. I've never felt more alive. And I can't really even, I wish I could put it into words. But I just thank Jesus for his patience and his persistence in my life. You know why? Because absolutely nothing compares with being a part of God's kingdom. I've experienced some other cool stuff. It is absolutely shallow compared to being a part of God's kingdom. Narrow is the road that leads to life, and few find it. If you find yourself in the crowd these days, for whatever reason, and you would characterize your interaction as more of a fan of Jesus than a follower, I just want to say to you, you have no idea, and I have no idea what God may have in store for you if you would just step out. Now, you probably are not going to be performing memorial services. Thank God. But he has got something deeply satisfying out there for you. He does. And it'll be hard, and it will require sacrifice, and it will be beautiful. But you actually have to follow to experience it. You have to follow. And this is why Jesus minces no words. He gets to the end of this sermon, and we go, whew, that was a beautiful talk. Why you got to end on such a downer? He's like, because this stuff matters, guys. There is life available to you, but there's only one way you can get it, and it's not by admiring me. It's not by being a fan. It's by following. This morning, as we worship, we're going to take communion together. I just want to encourage you to do some serious soul searching about your life and where you're at. Because if you're holding back in a certain area right now where you know God is calling you to take the next step, to do the next thing, I would just encourage you to ask yourself, why wouldn't you do that? Do you not trust that he knows what he's doing? Do you not trust that he knows more than you do about what you need in your life?